Welcome to this explainer. You know, when we think about the structural collapse of Nazi Germany, it's so easy to get caught up in battlefield tactics and individual maneuvers. But today, we're shifting our view entirely. We're going to look at a brutal, mathematically impossible war of attrition. We're getting right into the sheer mechanics of how a seemingly unstoppable force literally dismantled itself. Because think about the massive scale of the situation back in the summer of 1941. The German war machine looked, well, fundamentally invincible. I mean, their Blitzkrieg had completely shattered the armies of Western Europe in a matter of weeks, and their flag was flying from the Pyrenees all the way to the gates of Moscow. Yet, less than 4 years later, that exact same empire was reduced to smoking rubble, with its leadership hiding in a subterranean bunker. So we have to ask, how does a military force at the absolute peak of its operational power just entirely disintegrate? To figure that out, we need to perform what we call a logistical autopsy. Because the truth is, the fall of Nazi Germany was not decided by a single lost battle or a random stroke of bad luck. It was a cascading structural failure. By doing this autopsy, we can see exactly how the conflict shifted from lightning-fast tactical speed, which Germany absolutely excelled at, into a heavy industrial resource grind that they were fundamentally incapable of winning. Okay, so let's dive right into this medical examiner's report. We're going to map out 5 compounding causes of death: the two-front strategic trap, losing the industrial war, the Eastern Front meat grinder, getting paralyzed from above, and finally, the architect of ruin. Let's start with cause of death number 1, the two-front strategic trap, also known as the ghost of Bismarck. You see, for generations, German military doctrine avoided one absolute nightmare scenario, which was fighting a two-front war. It was the ghost of Bismarck, right? A fundamental rule for their very survival. But completely intoxicated by his rapid success in France, Hitler walked right into it with Operation Barbarossa in 1941. Suddenly, the Wehrmacht is forced to stretch its supply lines across thousands of miles of brutal, unpaved Russian territory, all while still having to permanently fortify a massive coastline against the undefeated British Empire over in the West. It was a geographic trap entirely of their own making. And that crippling overextension brings us to number 2, losing the Industrial War, or the War of the Factories. That geographic stretch directly triggered a massive war of the factories. Because World War II wasn't ultimately won in the trenches, it was won on the assembly line. On one side, you have the German manufacturing process. They were producing highly complex, beautifully engineered, but intricately slow Tiger tanks. But on the Allied side, it was a blur of standardized motion. The unstoppable American arsenal of democracy and the relocated Soviet factory cities were pumping out massive, standardized output. They replaced lost planes, ships, and tanks significantly faster than the Axis could ever hope to destroy them. The German manufacturing process was just completely dwarfed. And sitting at the absolute center of this industrial failure is oil. Germany was completely starved for the one resource absolutely required for modern mechanized warfare. In fact, their catastrophic push into the Caucasus region, which led directly to the infamous Battle of Stalingrad, wasn't just about conquering territory. Actually, scratch that, it was a desperate, panicked lunge to secure Soviet oil fields just to keep their existing tanks running. Because without that fuel, those incredibly engineered machines were literally just useless metal boxes. Which leads us to number 3, the Eastern Front meat grinder, the true graveyard of the Wehrmacht. That desperate push for oil led straight to a frozen graveyard. The German military wasn't just met with the unfathomable scale of the Soviet Red Army. They were swallowed by the environment itself. Relentless scorched earth defenses combined with brutal sub-zero blizzards essentially bled them dry. Battles like Stalingrad and Kursk weren't just tactical defeats. They were complete annihilations where entire elite German armies basically vanished into the snow. And it all really culminates in this one staggering number: 80%. Roughly 80% of all German military casualties in the entire Second World War occurred on the Eastern Front. The population of Germany simply couldn't replace the millions of young men being systematically slaughtered in this meat grinder. Moving on to number 4, paralyzed from above. Basically, total war in the skies and seas. So while the army was bleeding out in the snow, the homeland was being dismantled from the sky. Without air control, the German war machine was paralyzed. Allied strategic bombing didn't just drop payloads randomly. They surgically targeted the very nervous system of the Nazi state. By taking out oil refineries, ball-bearing factories, and railway networks, they permanently destroyed Germany's ability to manufacture weapons,
move their forces, or even supply the troops that were already desperately struggling out on the front lines.
Now you have to combine this complete lack of air superiority with the total failure of your U-boat campaign in the Atlantic Ocean. Because the sea lanes were finally secure, the Allies were able to build up the most massive amphibious invasion force in human history. When they landed at Normandy in 1944, that two-front nightmare we talked about earlier was fully, unavoidably realized. Germany was now caught in a crushing vice grip from the east, the west, and from above. Finally, we reach number 5. The architect of ruin, paralyzed by hubris. If those first 4 blows were failures of the body, like the limbs, the nervous system, the blood, this was essentially a failure of the brain. Ironically, the greatest strategic weapon the Allies had might have just been Hitler's own hubris. As the war turned against him and paranoia in the war room grew, he relentlessly micromanaged seasoned generals and routinely issued fanatical no-retreat orders to surrounded, freezing troops. By prioritizing blind ideological fanaticism over cold, hard logistics, he guaranteed the total, senseless loss of hundreds of thousands of his absolute best veteran soldiers. When we pull all this autopsy data together, it highlights a pretty incredible summary of their strategic arrogance. The leadership essentially engineered a scenario where a relatively small, resource-starved nation attempted to fight the 3 greatest global powers of the era: the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the United States, all at the exact same time. The logistical reality we've explored today proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the fall of the Third Reich wasn't due to a sudden stroke of misfortune or just a single bad day on the battlefield. It was a mathematical impossibility from the exact moment they overextended their lines and triggered a war of industrial attrition they just didn't have the resources to sustain. It was driven by absolute arrogance, inevitably ending in total ruin. Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought to ponder, and not just for this era of history, but really for any massive structural failure. When a system's collapse becomes mathematically certain, does hubris always blind leadership until the bunker walls finally cave in? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. If you appreciate these direct, structured, deep dives into the mechanics of history, keep exploring, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.